Thank you, Shahana. Uh, Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. And Bernardine, you've already had a session, but welcome again to Kolkata.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I thought I would start this session on Girl, Woman, Other with something uh, where the conversation you had yesterday about manifesto left off. And it was in an audience question where somebody was asking about what it meant to be a writer, a progressive person at this particular moment in history with, Donald Trump being reelected in America and all. And Trump, in fact, has identified diversity and DEI as sort of, as you call them, dirty words. You mentioned that yesterday. And this book is called Girl, Woman, Other. And he, as far as gender goes, one of the first things Trump said was there was no other. We have to be man or woman. And of course, this was written long before any of this transpired. But what do you make of this? These stories that are told in this book at this particular moment of our history?
I think one of the roles of a writer is to explore humanity and to explore the complexity and diversity in every sense of that word of who we are as people and to create stories from that. And in doing that, we can bridge differences and elicit empathy and all of those things that we would like to see represented in a really healthy civilization. So as a writer, that is what I do. And my focus has been on the African diaspora, especially from a British perspective. There is a character in Girl, Woman, Other who is non-binary. And because I decided I was going to have 12 women, essentially black women, at the time at which I started writing this book, which was about 2013, that sort of trans issue was coming to the fore. You know, gender was becoming much more, diverse, actually. And I was encountering lots of different terms coming out of America. And it was quite mind-blowing because I hadn't really engaged with it before. And so it felt really important to engage with it in this book. My sort of general feeling about issues around trans issues and gender is that you can't turn back the clock. People have been liberated. Younger people in particular have been liberated. And even though governments might try and legislate against people having diverse genders and self-identifying, ultimately, they're not going to be able to stop it because my generation are much less accepting of the idea of transgender identities than the people I teach in their 20s, essentially. So I think it's something that is going to be with us forever. And as we know, it has been with us forever in a way in certain cultures, including this culture. So I think it's very sad that we are entering a very repressive time in certain parts of the world, but they're not going to crush the human spirit, and they're not going to crush some of these progressive movements that are very personal to individuals and very dear to their sense of themselves and their self-expression. But the ride, I think, is going to be rocky for a while.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is like toothpaste. Once it's squeezed out of the tube, there's no way to push it back in. But at the same time, do you feel that sometimes this sort of, for want of a better word, the alphabet soup of identity, like LGBTQIA plus, I might still be missing some letters there. When we get hung up on these labels, might we be missing some larger human story? Because your book, as you said, has a dozen characters. In shorthand, people might say, this is a book about black women in Britain, but that in no way does justice to the diversity of stories, experiences, relationships, and that we encounter in the book.
I think these labels function. They have a very strong function in our society. If I was living in a world where we were not racialized, then the racial identity of my characters would not be something I would draw attention to because it wouldn't be an issue. But we are living in a racialized world. And these terms are ever evolving. When I was a child, I'm what's called mixed race or dual heritage, biracial. But when I was a child, the term was half caste, which was acceptable. The term for black people was colored, which was acceptable. And then those terms evolve and the original terms become insulting. You know, they become pejorative. And the LGBTQIA plus identity, I mean, it might continue to expand, right? But it's just it's just intended to be all-encompassing and to include everybody. And it's not as if people go around identifying themselves as such, because as we know, it doesn't matter what your identity is, you live your life and you carry on with your life. But for political purposes and for purposes of creating a healthy, inclusive society, these terms serve a function.
That just reminded me of a story. I had a friend who was trying to get all the alphabets right. And at that time, it wasn't even that big. You know, we would just say LGBT plus, but she would keep getting confused. So the way she tried to remember it was a BLT, like a sandwich, and then you had to add a G to it. So for her, LGBT was always BLT, G. But when you say about, you know, black women in the diaspora, and yesterday at the session you were mentioning in terms of your inspirations, people you were reading, many of them were American, Alice Walker, Audre Lorde, people like that. And it made me wonder whether the fact that in America, because the slave experience was so upfront and so huge and undeniable and tackled for it, many of these voices came out in the 60s and during the civil rights movement and all of that. In some ways, because Britain's history also developed somewhat differently, has it created more of a space, paradoxically, for a more diversity of kind of black British stories, where you didn't necessarily always have to deal each time with that one experience?
That's an interesting observation or question, but you know, Britain was the most powerful slave trading nation for maybe 100 years or 200 years. And, you know, Britain transported slaves to the Americas and also to the Caribbean, and slavery in the Caribbean was, in certain places, especially places like Jamaica, horrendous. If you want to understand slavery in Jamaica, read the great Marlon James's book, The Book of Night Women, which is so shocking and so powerfully told. So America is just very different to Britain. You know, it's a very different demographic. It's a very different history. You know, black people have been in Britain. I mean, the first black presence in Britain was 2,000 years ago, nearly 2,000 years ago. That's kind of the subject of my book, The Emperor's Babe, about a black girl who grows up in Roman London 2,000 years ago. That's very different to American history. Like I say, we have a very strong slave and colonial history. But I can't say that our literature is more diverse, black literature is more diverse than African American literature, because I'm not really across the breadth of African American literature. That would be a wrong thing to say. What I can say is that black British literature is slowly coming to prominence, and that there are more writers writing a plurality of stories in a way that we haven't seen before. You know, it's very easy to look at me, you know, Bernardine Evaristo won the Booker Prize 2019. It feels like such a long time ago now, 6 years, or well, 5 years. And a lot of people have read Girl, Woman, Other, which, you know, is incredible for me. But I have, as we talked yesterday, I've been a literary activist for a long time. I'm very aware of the bigger picture. And there are lots of other writers out there writing stories that also deserve to receive more attention. But the reason I wrote Girl, Woman, Other which I started, as I said, I think 2013, was because I wanted to explore the plurality of Black British women in society, because we weren't really being written about, because there weren't enough of us writing these stories. And so I decided initially I was going to write a novel about 1,000 women. And so they were only going to get so many words each. And my background's poetry, so I thought I could possibly do that. And then I thought that's a ridiculous idea. So then I thought about 100 women. And then that didn't work. And in the end, it became 12 women. But what I wanted to show was some sense of the heterogeneity of our experience, as opposed to what we have always had to fight against, which is stereotyping, or invisibility. That Black women are this, that, or the other. It's the same as saying Indian people are this, that, or the other. I mean, it's simply not true. Every nation, every country, every group has degrees of diversity, especially somewhere like India or the African continent, that is equal to Europe or to Britain. And so I just wanted to have these different characters who would be all different from each other. There are points of connection with some of them that would say, this is some of who we are, and we are many things.
Which was actually what I was going to ask you, whether this book came with a character, like did it begin with a character or did it begin with a form and a structure? And he seems to be suggesting that it was the form before the character.
Well, there's a sort of long answer to this story, or question rather, or a shorter answer. I'll give a short answer. So it actually began with a radio play that I wrote, inspired by Under Milkwood by Dylan Thomas, which was one of my favorite books as a child, as a teenager. And I wrote a short story in verse featuring 4 Black women, one of whom was trans. And I loved this idea of this, working with this landscape. And there were only 4 of them. It was a 15-minute word short story, so it was like 2,000 words or something. And that was the beginning of this book. But the form, and for those of you who have read the book, the form was the form that I use in the book. So it was basically a short story in verse using the form that you see in Girl, Woman, Other, but also my previous novel, Mr. Loverman, that some of that, there's a protagonist who's Barrington, he dominates the book, but his wife has subsections, and her subsections are written in the form I also use in Girl, Woman, Other, and I called it fusion fiction. Some people call it a verse novel. I don't think it's a verse novel. I wasn't thinking of poetry when I was writing it. I was simply thinking of how that form allowed me to tell this story in the way that I did, because it was very free-flowing. For those of you who have read it, it doesn't have many full stops.
Does it have any?
It does. It does. There are probably about 14 full stops, right? But it has commas, and it also has, it's shaped so that you can follow it. So some people have told me...
Full stops are overrated.
So
clearly.
Totally overrated. Some people have told me that when they start reading the book and they see that it's experimental and they see how the words are shaped on the page, they're like, oh, God, oh, no, I can't read this. But then if they get past the first 2 or 3 pages, they realize they're just into the book. And it's a really interesting thing what happens. When you get rid of the full stops, when you have the way, the sort of, I call it pro-poetic patterning, when you have that shape on the page, it's like you're just floating along inside the story without stopping, right? And then one story floats into another. And then I realized at some point that the full stop, what it is there to do is to stop, right? That's an obvious thing to say, but who ever thinks about the function of a full stop? Not really, except when you're learning what a full stop is. So I realized that the way in which I could tell the story, the past, the present, these different characters, their stories blending into each other, was because I did not have the full stops. I was not writing grammatically correct sentences, which would have closed in the concept of the novel.
Well, I think this is a perfect time to hear a bit, but take a sip of your did you get green tea?
Oh, my tea.
Your green tea. I think it's a great time to hear a little bit of the full stop-less prose.
So this is page 17, and the character is called Amma. She is the first character in the novel. She's reflecting back on her 20s when she was living in London, very much part of the countercultural community. She was working in theatre at the time, and she's living in a London squat. Now, for those of you who know London, or maybe knew London in the 60s and 70s and even 80s, there were squats in the city. So you could take over buildings, private houses, as well as big sort of factories or office blocks that were empty, and you could live there. And some people lived in those squats for many, many years, and you could live rent-free. So that's what she's taken over, the people she's with. The building was known as the Republic of Freedomia. They were lucky, too, because the owner of the property, a certain Jack Staniforth, living tax-free in Monte Carlo, loaded from the profits of his family business in Sheffield cutlery, turned out to be sympathetic to their cause once news reached him from his estate holding company. He'd fought for the International Brigade in the Spanish Civil War, and a bad investment of a building in one of London's seediest districts was a forgettable footnote to his accounts. If they looked after the place, he wrote, they could stay for free. They stopped the illegal tapping of electricity and opened an account with the London Electricity Board. Likewise with the gas, hitherto powered by a single 50-pence piece jammed into a meter. They needed to set up a management system and gathered one Saturday morning in the lobby to thrash it out. The Marxists demanded they set up a central committee of the Workers' Republic of Freedomia, which was a bit rich, Amma thought, seeing as most of them had taken a principled stand against the running dogs of capitalism as an excuse not to work. The hippies suggested they form a commune and share everything, but they were so chilled and laid back, everybody talked over them. The environmentalists wanted to ban aerosols, plastic bags, and deodorant, which turned everyone against them, even the punks, who weren't exactly known for smelling minty. The vegetarians demanded a non-meat policy. The vegans wanted it extended to non-dairy. The macrobiotics suggested everyone eat steamed white cabbage for breakfast. The Rastas wanted cannabis legalized and a reserved plot on the land out back for their Nyabingi gatherings. The Hare Krishnas wanted everyone to join them that very afternoon, banging drums down Oxford Street. The punks wanted permission to play shouty music and were duly shouted down. The gay guys wanted anti-homophobic legislation enshrined into the building's constitution, to which everyone replied, "What constitution?" The radical feminists wanted women-only quarters, self-governed by a co-op. The lesbian radical feminists wanted their own quarters away from the non-lesbian radical feminists, also self-governed by a co-op. The black radical lesbian feminists wanted the same, except with the condition that no whiteys of any gender were allowed inside. The anarchists walked out because any form of governance was a betrayal of everything they believed in.
If you had some Bengalis there, I don't know what. Maybe after this trip, you'll be able to add if there was what the Bengalis wanted. But it led me to wonder, listen, that is so funny, and I heard so many people chuckling about it. And you've said that at one point you were the angry, militant feminist. When did you and how did you realize that maybe humor was a better way to get the same point across?
Yeah, you're right. When I was writing in my 20s during my angry era, I wanted people to cry when they read my poetry or theatre. I felt tragic, and I wanted people to feel tragic when they read my work. But you can only sustain that for so long, to be honest. And I was also drinking too much. I was chain smoking, toxic relationship, the lot. And then in my early 30s, I had a huge change in my life, just in terms of, you know, I left that toxic relationship. If anybody was here yesterday, they heard me talk about it. I was living on my own. I was deciding I wanted to be a professional writer, writing books. I didn't have much money. I was doing a lot of self-development. And one of the turning points for me was there was a comedy duo in the UK called French and Saunders. I don't know if they ever came here, but they're two women who are very, very funny, and they had comedy programs. You know,
Jennifer Saunders.
Yeah, Jennifer Saunders and Dawn French. And at that time, comedy was very male. Well, it still is very, very male. But these were two women of my generation doing comedy. And I found them very inspiring and also very relatable, because this was young women's humor, which I hadn't seen on the television up to this point. And so I then started to put comedy into my writing with my second book. My first book was tragedy. The second book, Lara, I was finding my humor, and I was putting the humor I was seeing that they were exploring into my work. And ever since then, humor has been a theme running through my work in lots of different ways. One of my books, Blonde Roots, is satire. It's a role reversal of the slave trade, where Africans enslaved Europeans, and it's savage satire. But then other books, such as Girl, Woman, Other, I think it's very gentle comedy, and the comedy comes from kind of exposing human frailties and weaknesses and ridiculousness through how the characters present themselves, but then how other characters see them. Because it's a book where everyone is not just presenting themselves, they're also being seen from numerous perspectives. And I think there's a lot of humor in that, because I think we are all, in a way, not as self-conscious about ourselves as we like to think we are, and that other people will often see humor in us, even though we won't see it ourselves. You know, I think we are often, as humans, we're often in denial about a lot of aspects of ourselves.
Yeah, it's like the bald spot on the back of your head, which you think you can't see, but somebody behind you takes a picture, and then you're like, oh, that's what I look like from the back. But for example, when you talk of the humor, a lot of this book it opens with a play that's happening at the National Theatre, and it's The Last Amazon of Dahomey, which your character Amma has written, and it's finally opening in the National Theatre. And I wanted you to just explain the significance of both parts of that, the play itself and the fact that it's at the National Theatre, because it so beautifully and humorously encapsulates so much of the tensions we face in terms of wanting recognition, but at what cost? And as soon as we get it, like as soon as we win the Booker, are we now therefore part of the establishment and therefore no longer cool and selling out?
All of those things, yeah. So the character of Amma she's one of the 12 characters, and she's the only one that's loosely based on myself. And anybody who knows me will recognize bits of my early life in her story. And she's somebody who's a feminist theatre maker and has been for 40 years, struggling on the outside, very kind of self-righteous, very critical of the mainstream, until she reaches a point in her career where she's desperate to be accepted, and she's desperate to be part of the mainstream, but without compromising. And so she gets this opportunity to have her play The Last Amazons of Dahomey, and I'm sure we all know the Amazons were women warriors originally in ancient Greek mythology, but they were Amazons in Dahomey in Benin in West Africa, who were the king's armed guards. And I think the Amazons were around for about 200 years. So these were women warriors who lived in the king's compound and went to war on his behalf. So it felt very appropriate for this book about women to have, partly framing it, these women warriors of history. So she gets the call from the National Theatre, and she's putting on her play, and that bookends the novel. The first night, about to open the play, and then the end of it. And of course, she does have all these issues about, is she selling out? She's accused of selling out, which there's a lot of humor in that as well, I think. And then in a way, what happens to her was then mirrored by me, in a sense, because the book was published in May 2019. By October, November 2019, I'd won the Booker. So like suddenly I went from not quite on the fringes as she was, because my career had always developed and had a degree of success, but I definitely went into the center overnight, literally into the center. And that was a huge, huge shock for me, but also for black women, black British women, because I was the first black woman to win the Booker. I think she's the first black woman to have a play on at the National Theatre. So it was almost like life imitating art in a sense. But I'm very, very interested in those issues of who we are, where we come from. Anybody reading any of my books is always there. You always get a sense of where the characters come from. And all of these characters, you might hopefully understand them fully, because you see them from their childhood to whatever age they are in the book. So I'm always interested in where we come from, where we end up, and the journey to getting there, and all the issues that we have to contend with as people. And Emma's thing is very much about her career, which is so important to so many of us, but it's also something we don't really talk about or explore. And she's gone from this Amazon figure herself to eventually an establishment lovey over the course of 40 years. And I'm very interested in how I see the people around me doing this, you know? The people I knew who were once radical outsiders suddenly becoming incredibly establishment. So those are sort of some of the things I enjoy exploring.
Where do you place yourself?
I am a radical member of the establishment.
She is the president of the Royal
I
Society.
am the president. No, but I tell you, if you're a university professor, you can't say you're not part of the establishment. You know, even my publisher, Penguin, is very much an establishment publisher. I mean, it took 2 books to get there, to be published by Penguin. But I advocate for inclusion, and that's what I've always done, and that hasn't changed. And I've used my platform and my voice, the hearing that I now have in the world since winning the Booker. I've used that to, I hate using that term because it's so cliched, but to lift up those communities who need to be lifted up in the UK, and also African writers, which is something else I've been doing. So when I say radical member of the establishment, I do mean that. I'm not inside the establishment, feathering my own nest and endorsing the status quo as it is and has always been. That's not what I'm doing.
Did you like Emma in the book? She's advised, because as you said, she takes 30, 40 years to finally get to the National Theatre. And one of her friends is saying, well, you know, if I'd advised her to direct multicultural adaptations of Shakespeare, and she would have been there far sooner, but instead she kept doing these plays about black women. Did you face advice like that?
I don't really take that kind of advice. So if I did, I probably didn't listen to them.
She didn't either.
She didn't either, no. You know, I feel as a writer, I have full freedom to write the kinds of novels and books that I want to write. And I'm with an editor. He's called Simon Prosser. I've been with him now at Penguin since, I think I joined in 1999. And he always wants me to do my own thing, and he will support me in doing that. So I have never had pressure from my publisher to write more traditional books, or, you know, to write books that people think will appeal more to Middle England and so on. But the creative process for me is so precious that I cannot write against my instincts and my political beliefs. I mean, when I say no, that's the wrong expression, because that sounds like all my books are about my politics, and they're not. But I have to stay true to my integrity. I have to maintain my integrity, and that is what drives me. And then, lo and behold, Girl, Woman, Other, which is a radical, experimental, queer, inclusive novel, is loved by Middle England. Right? They love it, right? Because it got the Booker stamp of approval. And so suddenly a book like that reaches an audience who would probably have not thought it was for them, but for the booker.
But is it also true, I'd read that until it was nominated for the Booker, it didn't have an American publisher or something, or was close to that?
It got an American publisher when it was listed for the Booker.
When it was listed for
yes, from the long list. There's a long process with the Booker. It starts in well, it did start in July, and then it's announced in, I forget now, it's October, November, but it's a long running. So as soon as you get onto the list, publishers start to take more attention.
What's the most bizarre thing that's happened to you as a result of the Booker?
I don't know. This is the kind of question I can't answer. It went from, oh yeah, Bernardine Evaristo, I think I've heard of her, to, you know, heavyweight writer Bernardine Evaristo, literally overnight. But, you know, I had 40 years of not having that. So, you know, I'm very grounded.
When you talked about these 12 characters and, you know, we talked a lot about Amma. There's Dominique, who has been in the toxic, asphyxiating relationship with an older woman for a long time. There's Carol, I guess, who is very focused on a corporate success, and she has these sort of self-affirming mantras. There's actually a character named Bumi, who is this Nigerian mother who wants her daughter to succeed, but then is aghast when she brings home a white boyfriend. And when you were talking yesterday, I thought she's almost the Nigerian counterpart of your white grandmother that you were talking about yesterday. I mean, I don't know if you felt that way, but...
Not really, because Bumi is, you know, she's a Nigerian immigrant. She hasn't really moved beyond her West African culture in London. And she really assumed her daughter Carol, her one daughter Carol, who goes to Oxford, that she would marry a Nigerian man. So she's deeply disappointed when Carol comes home and says she's going to marry Freddie. But she does embrace Freddie. And that's different because my grandmother did not embrace my dad. Yeah.
So in all these characters, I just wanted to know in terms of process, how challenging was it for you as a writer to keep all these characters, these balls juggling in the air and keep them straight and distinct and separate and not have their voices meld into each other?
Very, very challenging process writing the book. It took 5 years or so because there are these 12 characters, because I use that experimental form where there aren't sort of proper sentences. Creating the characters' voices was not a problem with most of them, and that's because I'm very much a character-driven writer. This was my 8th book. I had started off in theatre, writing characters for theatre, and I'd written a whole range of characters. And the reason I write is because I love writing characters and stepping inside their skin and kind of trying to write them from the inside. And so there are these 12 characters, but it wasn't such a challenge. I could not have written this book, you know, in my 20s or 30s, probably not even in my 40s. You know, I had to reach a stage in my life where I could grapple with those characters. The problem was the structure, to have these 12 distinct characters who appear in each other's stories, and then to try and juggle the timeline of each, all the characters and their relationships. It was a nightmare. Because if you read it and try to deconstruct it, you will see that, you know, this character appears in this story at this time, and then this character appears, and then they also appear in each other's stories at different time, and it was a mess. The first draft was a mess. And I have readers, and I gave it to a reader, and I said to her, "What do you think?" I knew it was a mess, and I needed some help, and she said, "Well, it's readable." I say that to my students. It's readable. I'm like, and it wasn't even really readable, to be honest, at that stage. It took all those drafts to refine it and to work out how this book, with all these characters, with all the history with each characters, with this web of relationships, how it could be an easy book for people to read so they could follow it logically, chronologically, and not get confused with stuff. And it was very, very challenging. One character was very hard to write, in spite of the fact that I already had a lot of experience writing characters, and that was Grace. And Grace is a character who lives in the north of England. She's born in the 19th century. She's the only one who's not alive. And I somehow was treating her with too much reverence. And that's a kiss of death as a writer. I was treating her as a victim of circumstance, a mixed-race woman born in the north of England in the 19th century on a farm in the middle of nowhere. I was like, oh my God, so isolated and so much entrenched racism around at that time. And so I never felt that I could bring her to life. I almost got rid of her because I felt there was a problem I could not solve. And then eventually I was able to make her as flawed and, if not as lively, but as dynamic as the other characters, in the sense that she's multidimensional. But it was a challenge to do that.
And I'm not going to ask you which one's your favorite, because that's a horrible question to ask.
No, you can ask it.
Okay, I'll ask you.
So I really like Yaz, because Yaz is
She's
funny.
Emma's daughter.
Emma's daughter, she's 19, she's very feisty.
And she has a crazy afro.
She's got a big afro, she thinks she knows it all, and she's really hard on her parents. So I adore Yaz. I like all my children, of course, but Yaz is great, and also Hattie, the 94-year-old farmer living in the north of England, who is formidably independent and strong and powerful. I love her as a character.
And were those the ones you also had the most fun writing?
Maybe. You know, with Hattie, the goal was to write a woman of a great age, and 94 is a great age, who is independent, who does not have dementia, who has her mental faculties completely intact, and who is full of personality and character, and a lot to live for. Because I was writing against how old people are portrayed. When I say old, some people say I'm old, right? I'm 65, but I'm talking about somebody 30 years older than me, who's living on a farm. She's a farmer. She's lived on that farm all her life. So that was the challenge, to write against the stereotypes that are so prevalent, especially when young people write older characters. Because you ask a 20-year-old to write about a 40-year-old, and they've got them with a walking stick, kind of like, you know, hardly able to walk or talk. And I tell you this because I'm a teacher, so I know. And then, you know, by the time somebody's 60, I mean, they would never have a sex life. That's it. Everything, life is over, you know. So that's what we're kind of.
There's some shocking sex life in the book. Just a teaser.
Oh yeah, it's good though, isn't it? It's good. The book is full of surprises. So Hattie was sort of. I wanted her to be a triumphant figure.
I wanted to open this up for questions. So if you put your hand up, we'll try and get a mic to you. I think I see a hand. It's really bright, but I see a hand in the back.
It'd be really
there.
nice if women ask questions as well.
There's. Were you just? I can't tell whether people are fixing their hair or they're asking a question.
Keep it up. Keep it up. Keep your hand up.
There you go.
Thank you so much, ma'am. My question is, how do I be an ally for those people who are actually in the LGBTQ and also non-binary and gender non-conforming? Because many a times, which I've noticed, is that they feel us who are from the other community as a threat, but we don't want to be us. We want all of us in this together. How do I be that?
Oh, God, what a question. You need to have conversations with people who identify as such and understand. And also, I think an ally is somebody who is not paternalistic or patronizing or consider themselves to be superior to the group that they're professing allyship towards. You know, it's finding in yourself a genuine interest in knowing how you can support people who need the support, but finding out from them what that support would be. And sometimes that means speaking out and up, right? A lot of people they consider themselves allies because in their heads they're supporting people from those communities, but they're not actually doing anything. But I think you need to have those conversations with people as equals.
All right, there's a question up in front here.
First of all, I'd like to say that you're my literary hero.
There you go.
You are, and reading Girl, Woman, Other really changed my life. So my question for you is that in the beginning of the session, you talked about pro-poetic patterning. So basically the form that you use in the novel, and we find in the novel that it's very interconnected. You know, the stories of these women, the lives are all interconnected and it's woven with each other. So this form that you use, was it just the form that you're comfortable using because you've already done that in the past, but also because you're trying to establish a kind of, you know, it's a, I suppose, what is the word? Like, you're trying to challenge the heteronormativity and the hegemonic power structure of patriarchy through this form.
That's not exactly what I'm thinking when I'm writing, but I know what you mean. I have been an experimental writer all my life, even when I was working for theatre, when I was writing plays or dramatic poems or verse drama, whatever I called it. So the experimental gene has been in me for a long time, long before Girl, Woman, Other. And it is there because I want to find the form that suits what I want to have to say, what I want to say. And that means breaking free of what is expected, breaking free of convention, which I do anyway in my life, but I do it with my writing, and I've always done it with my writing. So while I'm not thinking about, you know, hegemony and patriarchy and all those things when I'm writing, I'm just giving myself the liberty to find a form that will suit and fit what I want to say. And that goes back to when I was a drama student a very, very long time ago.
So, question back there. And then we'll try and get to you.
I'm sorry, but mine is not going to be a question. It's kind of a piano of praise for
praise
for
is
you.
all right, but keep
Okay.
it concise, though.
I will keep it very concise. Thank you very much for this book. It made my COVID days livable. I was living all alone in Europe in a house, and this was delivered to me by Amazon. And the sales must have gone up at that time, because after that, I gave it to simply everybody for their birthdays or whatever days. So thank you very much, and you're right, it's kind of breathless. It's only towards the end I realized there are no full stops. So it's, you know, like, it's extraordinarily written and interwoven, and thank you very much.
You're welcome. Just to mention Amazon, although, you know, Amazon right now is... Anyway, but just to say, in America, somebody complained to Amazon, the American version of the book, which is the same as the British version, they complained that the formatting was incorrect because of the formatting on the page and the absence of punctuation. And they took it off. Amazon took it off for about a week or so before my publisher could convince them it was intentional, because somebody complained.
The last period of Amazon. Missing periods of Amazon. There was a question back there, and then there was, I think somebody, two more, or one. Let's just take these two questions, and we'll try and answer them together. So whoever, I think somebody,
I think I have.
Yeah, go for it.
I had a question that, how did you choose the characters? Did they just come about, or you had a criteria that...
So I wanted a range of characters, and I started off with Carol. So she was the first character, and I found her really interesting because I thought, this is a black woman negotiating the business world, and that's something we don't see in fiction. And then through Carol, her story emerged, and then Bumi, her mother, came into her childhood. And then I really liked Bumi and decided that she would have her own section. And then eventually Letitia, Carol's childhood friend, also had her own section, but she came a bit later. And then I thought, okay, so I've got a sort of Nigerian immigrant, I've got a Black British or African origin girl in the business world, young woman in the business world. And then I thought, let me write an Amma character, because she's living through an era I lived through, that the only people who are going to be able to write that with any authenticity, to be honest, will be the people who lived it. Because there's nothing out there about it, about the young Black women in the 80s who were creating theatre and so on and so forth. Nobody had written about it. There was no record. It was invisible. If we didn't write about it, it was going to be erased. So then I wrote Amma. Through Amma, I thought, okay, Amma has to have a really close friend, because I want to have strong female friendship in the book. So then Dominique emerged. And then I thought, of course, Amma's got to have a child. And then there was Yaz. And so the characters emerge through each other. And then I thought, I need to go to the north of England, because at this point we had Brexit. And there was a lot of conversation about the metropolitan elite. And a lot of Londoners were really shocked at Brexit, British people, but Londoners in particular, shocked that Brexit happened, because we weren't aware of the conversations happening around the country. Because we were siloed. You know, that became a very fashionable word in 2016. We were all living in our own silos. And then I thought, north of England, right in the north, Northumberland, farming people, because that we do not, in the UK, have Black people living on farms. I mean, it's not known. We're not known to live on farms. We lived in cities, or live in cities. So then I had 3 generations in the north of England. So yeah, that was some of the decision-making process.
I think we're out of time. Somebody there was trying to ask a question for a long time. If you could keep it very short, that would be great. Thank you.
First of all, an honor, obviously. So the very brilliant phrasing that you made, that radical part of the establishment, that made me think of Aunt Lydia from The Testament, the book you own alongside the Booker. And she was very much like a part of the establishment and trying to bring it down from inside. My question was, as the literary pantheon, which continues to be white, predominantly white, the canonization, from our Shakespeare's to our Christie's to our, even the postmodernists like Italo Calvino, continues to be a very white canon. How do the writers of this generation, say from you to R.F. Kuang to our Amitabh Ghosh, the effect that this non-white writers had, how do we question that traditional approach towards canon literature, which continues to be white?
You know, it isn't completely anymore. I mean, I can only talk about the UK. You know, we have this, it was a kind of movement decolonizing the curriculum, which kind of arose up maybe about, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, where people started to challenge the curriculum. And one of the things that was discovered was that, you know, children could go through the whole of their education system without studying a single book by a writer of color, right? And so now that's starting to change. The examining boards have diversified the curriculum. So some of my work is on A-level syllabus, for example. And then in universities, there's been a challenge with that as well, because, you know, a lot of academics are very protective of their right to create their own reading lists, right? And so when they're told that their reading lists are, not diverse enough, they took offense at that. But with a little bit of imagination, people have been able to diversify their reading lists. I can't talk about the whole country. I teach at Brunel University of London. I know that definitely happened in my department. But there needs to be active schemes and engagement with, for example, academics or the school examining boards to make the case for teaching a diverse range of literature. And if we're going to have canons, and you know, I don't think we're ever going to get rid of canons, then those canons need to be more inclusive. And the argument against inclusivity is always that it's only that people make their decisions based on quality of writing standards, and that once you get diversity, standards are lowered, which is ridiculous, and it's constant in the media. I have been the victim of this with an organization I'm associated with in the past year, right? So there are always going to be people who are against this, not least that creature who's just taken over in you know, that big house in America, right, who's put all the DEI government people on paid leave, right? The people don't understand how important it is that our societies are inclusive and representative, and that everybody feels they can participate actively in the societies that we're creating. And literature is a part of that. So for example, the individuals here who are teaching in universities, they need to go back and look at their reading lists and see if the reading lists are diverse enough, and if not, finding the very high quality literature that can broaden the work, not least for the students, so that students can start to see themselves reflected in the literature, because very often they don't.
We are going to have to leave it there. Please join me in thanking Bernardine for coming to the Kolkata Literary Meet and spending time with us. She will be signing books, so if you didn't get to ask your question, you still get one shot at it.
Just to say thank you to the organisers of the Kolkata Lit Meet. I did thank them 2 days ago, and I kind of forgot to thank them at the beginning. But it's been wonderful to be here. I'm so grateful to be talking to you, and it's a wonderful festival, and yeah, it's just been great. So thanks to the organisers.